The Supreme Court heard arguments today in a legal case that could vastly expand presidential powers. At stake are 90 years of precedent that have kept presidents from being able to remove members of independent government agencies. The case looks at whether President Trump acted legally in firing Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic member of the bipartisan Federal Trade Commission, saying her service was inconsistent with Trump administration priorities.
The Supreme Court just delivered an absolutely devastating blow to Donald Trump. And what happened is stunning. In a 6-3 decision, the justices blocked the president from deploying National Guard troops domestically without proper legal authority. This isn't just another court ruling. This is the Supreme Court telling the White House that executive power has real limits, and the president is furious about it because even with his own appointees on the bench, the court just constrained presidential authority in the most public and humiliating way possible. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why 3 conservative justices voted against the administration, and what this means for executive power going forward. But real quick, before we get into this, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built John Brown's show, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. And seriously, check right now if you're actually subscribed to this channel, because you might think you are but aren't. Your subscription actually matters here. All right, let's get into what actually happened. The administration wanted to deploy 300 National Guard troops in Chicago. The stated reason was protecting federal buildings and supporting ICE operations. The plan was to federalize Guard troops and use them for law enforcement purposes in a Democratic-controlled city. But here's the problem. The governor of Illinois said no. The mayor of Chicago said no. State officials explicitly told the White House they didn't want federal troops deployed. They said the state could handle the situation with state resources, and they argued the federal government didn't have authority to override them. So the White House went to the Supreme Court asking for emergency relief. The request was simple: let us deploy the troops while the case gets litigated. And the expectation was that the court would back up the president. There was real confidence this would be approved. But the Supreme Court said no. 6 justices rejected the request. 6 justices said the deployment couldn't proceed. And here's what's absolutely stunning about this. 3 of those 6 justices are conservatives. 3 of them are either presidential appointees or justices who typically support broad executive authority. They voted against the administration. That's extraordinary. That shows how serious the court took this constitutional issue. Now let me bring the receipts on what the court actually said, because the legal reasoning is critical. The justices said the president needs statutory or constitutional authority to deploy the Guard for law enforcement. You can't just rely on vague inherent power or broad commander-in-chief claims. There has to be a specific law that authorizes what's being attempted, and the administration couldn't point to one. The legal team couldn't cite a statute allowing Guard deployment for this purpose. They couldn't identify constitutional language supporting the position. There was no legal basis. The argument basically boiled down to the president has inherent power and courts shouldn't review these military decisions. But the Supreme Court strongly rejected that argument. The justices said courts absolutely have a role in reviewing these decisions. Presidents don't have unlimited power just because they hold office. Even commander-in-chief authority has specific legal limits, and courts can enforce those limits. Notice what the court is doing here. The justices are establishing that presidential power has boundaries, that even military decisions are subject to judicial review, that no president gets unreviewable authority on any issue. This is the Supreme Court saying everyone has to follow the law, including the president. And the court laid out a very specific test that has to be met. Under the applicable statute, the president must first be unable to accomplish the mission with regular military forces before calling up the Guard. Think about what that means. If regular military can do the job, that's what has to be used. The Guard can only be utilized as a last resort when other options are exhausted. And the court said that test wasn't met here. The administration didn't show that regular forces couldn't accomplish the task. They just wanted to use the Guard, and that's not good enough under the law. Now here's where the administration's argument completely fell apart. The Solicitor General argued that courts have basically no role in reviewing guard deployment decisions. The position was that this is purely a presidential function that courts cannot interfere with, that it's exclusively an executive decision without judicial oversight. But the Supreme Court demolished that argument. The justices said courts absolutely can and will review these decisions. They can examine whether the president stays within legal bounds. No presidential decision is completely beyond judicial review, and that's a fundamental principle of constitutional government. Let me show you why this is such a major defeat. This is described as one of the rare losses at the Supreme Court for this administration. The court has a conservative majority. There are friendly appointees on the bench. This case should have been won easily, but the administration lost decisively, lost with 3 conservative justices voting against them. That shows this wasn't a close call. That shows the legal argument was weak. That shows even justices sympathetic to executive power thought this went too far. And what makes this even more significant is what it means for future plans. The strategy has been to use the Guard as a tool for federal law enforcement, to deploy troops in cities deemed out of control, to show military force as part of law and order messaging. But now the Supreme Court has established clear constraints. Statutory authority is required. Specific legal tests must be met. Courts will review these decisions and block them if they don't meet legal requirements. That severely limits what can be done going forward. Make sure you're subscribed to John Bro Show because we're going to keep tracking how this affects the administration's ability to govern. We're going to document every time courts block executive overreach, because this ruling establishes precedent that applies to any president going forward. Now let's talk about what the court said about the specific legal requirements. The justices made clear that if regular military forces can accomplish the mission, those forces must be used instead of the Guard. The Guard can only be called up when regular forces demonstrably cannot do the job. That's a specific, measurable constraint. And it's one the administration failed to meet in this case. The White House didn't show that regular military couldn't handle security for federal buildings, didn't demonstrate that regular forces couldn't support ICE operations, just claimed the Guard was needed without proving other options wouldn't work. And the court said that's not sufficient under the law. You have to actually meet the statutory test. You have to show you've exhausted other options. You can't just deploy the Guard because it's convenient or politically useful. And here's what this reveals about judicial review of executive power. The court rejected the idea that these decisions are completely unreviewable, rejected the claim that presidential military decisions are beyond judicial scrutiny, established that courts will enforce legal limits even on commander-in-chief authority. That's a major statement about the balance of power, about checks and balances, about the rule of law applying to everyone including the president. Notice how this fits into a broader pattern. Courts have been blocking executive actions repeatedly, rejecting immunity claims, striking down executive orders, constraining presidential authority across multiple issues, and now limiting power over the National Guard. This is institutions pushing back. This is checks and balances actually functioning. This is the constitutional system working as designed to prevent executive overreach. Now, let me explain the specific impact this has on public perception. The entire brand has been built on strength and power, on the ability to do things other presidents can't do, on having unique authority to execute vision without constraints. But the Supreme Court is showing that's not true, that there are real limits, that everyone is constrained by law. And when people see the court blocking plans, see legal battles being lost, see even conservative justices ruling against the administration, that affects how they view presidential power. It shows it's not absolute. It demonstrates there are checks. It proves the system can constrain executive authority. And this ruling will likely deter future attempts to deploy the Guard domestically without proper legal authority, because now everyone knows the Supreme Court will scrutinize these decisions, will require statutory authorization, will enforce specific legal tests, will block deployments that don't meet legal requirements. That creates hesitation before trying similar actions. That makes future presidents think twice. That deters executive overreach. Share this video with everyone you know because people need to understand what just happened. The Supreme Court, with 3 conservative justices joining the decision, just established clear limits on presidential power over the National Guard, established that statutory authority is required, Establish that courts will review these decisions. Establish that no president gets unreviewable authority. This affects not just the current administration, but any president going forward. These legal requirements are now binding precedent. Future presidents will have to meet the same tests. Will have to show statutory authority. Will have to prove regular military can't accomplish the mission before deploying the Guard. No one gets unlimited power. And that's good for constitutional government, good for checks and balances, good for the rule of law, good for the principle that no one is above the law. Now let's talk about what makes the 6-3 vote so significant. This wasn't a close decision, this was decisive. 3 conservative justices concluded the legal argument didn't hold up, concluded the administration was overreaching, concluded that limits needed to be enforced. That's remarkable given the typical alignment on executive power issues. That shows how weak the legal position was. That demonstrates this crossed a line even conservative justices weren't willing to accept, and the court's reasoning was very clear and direct. Presidents need legal authority for what they're trying to do. Can't just claim inherent power. Can't argue that courts have no role in reviewing decisions. Have to follow the law like everyone else. Now here's what the administration argued that got rejected. The position was that determining when to deploy the Guard is purely a presidential function, that it's part of commander-in-chief authority, that courts cannot and should not review these decisions, that the president's judgment is final and unreviewable. But the Supreme Court said that's fundamentally wrong. Said courts absolutely have a role. Said presidential power has limits. Said those limits can be enforced through judicial review. Said no decision is completely beyond court scrutiny. That's a major rejection of the expansive view of executive power. That's the court saying constitutional constraints apply to everyone. That's establishing that checks and balances actually work, and the practical impact is immediate. The Guard deployment to Chicago is blocked. Can't proceed without meeting legal requirements. Can't happen just because the administration thinks it's necessary. Has to be justified under the statute, has to meet specific tests, has to survive judicial review. Now let me show you what this means for the broader executive power debate. This ruling establishes that even military decisions have legal limits, that commander-in-chief authority isn't a blank check, that presidents have to follow statutory requirements, that courts will enforce those requirements. This applies beyond just Guard deployments. This is a statement about executive power generally, about the limits that exist, about the role courts play in enforcing those limits. And it's particularly significant that conservative justices joined this opinion because it shows these limits aren't just liberal judicial activism, these are constitutional principles that transcend ideology. These are checks and balances that even conservative jurists will enforce. That's powerful. That's meaningful. That establishes this isn't partisan. This is about the structure of government, about preventing any president from accumulating too much power. The bottom line is this. The Supreme Court blocked the administration from deploying National Guard troops in Chicago without proper statutory authority. Did so in a 6-3 decision with 3 conservative justices joining. Established that presidents need specific legal authorization for Guard deployments. Established that if regular military can do the job, that's what must be used. Established that courts can and will review these decisions. Rejected the argument that presidential military decisions are unreviewable. This is a major defeat for executive power expansion. This is the court establishing clear limits. This is checks and balances working. This is the rule of law being enforced. And the reaction is fury. Because the expectation was that the court would back up the administration. The belief was that conservative justices would support broad executive authority. The assumption was this would be approved. But the court said no, established limits, enforced the law, and showed that even presidents are constrained. That's what makes this so significant. That's why this matters. That's the story. Stay tuned.